Hey, welcome back. Shirt construction this time, so you should be in possession of the pattern that you drafted from the last video, or any shirt pattern, and the will to wing it if something is different, or no pattern at all and just a curious mind. I'm not fussed. The pattern I use looks something like this. So back, yoke, front, sleeve, cuff, placket, button bands, collar band, and collar. A well-established and sensible way to cut this kind of pattern is to fold your fabric long ways, so the selvages are together and the grain of the fabric is this way, and then lay all the pieces with a fold edge along the fold edge and everything else wherever it will fit in the right orientation. There is no right or wrong way to do this as long as you end up with the right number of each bit, so think it through and cut in a sensible way for your fabric and your pattern. And yes, you can cut some bits perpendicular to the grain, just pre-wash your fabric and it should be fine. So this layout will result in one yoke, one back, one collar band, one collar, all of that on the fold, two fronts, two button bands, two sleeves, two cuffs, and two plackets. However, a bunch of stuff in this shirt is double thickness, so you'll need another collar piece in the same fabric, and then the way I usually do it, a second yoke, collar band, pair of cuffs, and pair of button bands in a contrast fabric. You can do it all in the same fabric, it just looks really nice to use a fancy fabric for those bits, or if the whole shirt is fancy fabric, it may need toning down with a bit of plain fabric for those bits. And if this is your first time, consider doing the whole thing with an old bedsheet rather than your favorite ever, most beloved, expensive vintage fabric that you can never ever get again. For Julian's shirts, I often use quilt cotton, which is about 112 centimeters wide, and I use about 1 to 1.5 meters of the main fabric and half a meter of the contrast. But he's pretty small, so estimate up if you're not small. If your fabric is a bit floopy, and or if you want your cuffs, collar, and button bands to be a bit stiffer and hold their shape, you may also want to cut a pair of cuffs, a pair of button bands, one collar, and one collar band out of a suitable interfacing, either iron-on or sew-in as you prefer. Search interfacing and how to use it if you're not sure what I'm talking about. And a downloadable PDF is linked to below with a cutting list if that's helpful to you. So cut all your bits and drape them around the place over chair backs and bed frames and make sure you remember what they all are. Now, very briefly, this is the order we're going to do things in. 1. Plackets onto sleeve ends. 2. If you're back here after watching video 3 in the series and are adding darts or pockets, you'll do them now. 3. All the body bits made into a sort of tabard. 4. Sleeves attached to the arm's eyes. 5. The underarm seam closed up. 6. Cuffs onto the sleeve ends. 7. Hem the bottom edge. 8. Button bands onto the front edges. 9. Collar enclosing the neck opening. And 10. Buttonholes and buttons. Right, ready? Here's that same list, but with more explanation. Plackets. Go and watch video 2.1. It's linked to below. There's a whole other mini video about this because it's awkward and complicated and you will need reminding the first 5 times you do it, and thereafter you won't anymore. Come back when you've done the plackets. Step 2. If you've got pockets or darts to add, do it now. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, ignore me for now and we'll cover it in video 3. Step 3. All the body bits. The 2 yoke bits will ultimately be wrong sides together, i.e. right sides facing the world on the outside and inside of the shirt respectively, with the back and the 2 fronts tucked in between them and all the raw edges folded in and enclosed, and possibly top stitched. But how we're going to get there is a fancy bit of inside outery. Start by putting the 2 yokes and the back all laid out relative to each other the way they will ultimately end up. Then peel back the 2 yokes either side of the back, line up the edge, and pin and sew through all 3 layers. So when you turn that sandwich right side out, the back of the shirt should all be in the right order and orientation. Now, put it back in sandwich form, but fold and then roll the back piece so that the yoke's shoulder seams can meet unhindered. Line up the 2 front pieces in real orientation so you know where they're going to go. Double check that you're right about which one is which and which way up they should go. Fold, roll, and flip them to the inside of the sandwich and put the top yoke bit down on top. And then just double check. That sandwich from bottom up should be wrong side of yoke lining, right side of yoke lining, wrong side of body pieces, right side of body pieces, right side of your outer yoke, wrong side of your outer yoke. All good? Good, good. Very demoralizing to have to unpick this bit. Stitch it up at the shoulders, and now you can pull all that rolled sandwich filling out through the neck opening. Flip the whole lot inside out, and you should be looking at a tabard-shaped shirt body with everything the right way around. Feel free to press and or top stitch along those folded underseams if you like. Both things are optional. I do tend to stay stitched quite close to the open edges of the arm side and the neck opening just to keep things from wandering around later. And if any bits ended up looking a bit pointy where 2 pieces meet, just trim them straight, and if applicable, go and adjust your pattern. 4. The sleeves. If you lay the body out like this, right side up, the sleeves, also right side up, go here with the plackets towards the back. Attaching them is a little awkward because of the non-matching curves of the edges. The corners are okay. By the time you've flipped this onto that, they kind of match, but this stretch is curved on this side and not so curved on that side, so you need to do a thing. Clip about 1 centimeter into the edge of the arm's eye at intervals over the top of the shoulder to allow it to splay as it meets the curve at the top of the sleeve. These little clipped bits will be in the seam allowance, so they won't be visible on the outside of the shirt. Now, flip the sleeve so the shoulder edges are right sides together, and starting at one side, line up the corner. Put a couple of pins in this side, and then haul the sleeve round to the opposite corner and put a couple of pins there. You're going to work your way in from both ends, pinning these edges together in biggish increments until you meet at the top of the shoulder. The little clipped bits will help you line up the seam allowance with less distortion. If your pattern is well drafted, you shouldn't end up with a lot of excess on either bit, unless you meant to. See video 3. If either the sleeve or the yoke has a little extra, fiddle the pins and redistribute the fabric till it works, and consider altering the pattern if there's really too much of one bit or the other. Once it's distributed and pinned pretty thoroughly, sew all along that edge slowly and carefully. I find it easiest to sew this with the sleeve down and the shirt body up so that I can keep an eye on those little notches and move all the excess flapping folds of fabric as I go. This, by the way, is one of 2 places where the seams will be raw on the inside of the garment unless you do something about it. You can overlock if you have an overlocker, or you can make a second line of stitching a little closer to the edge and clip the excess away if it frays. You could put bias binding over it if you are really into fiddly tasks. Or you could just say to hell with it and let it fray, a solution I turn to often. The second line of stitching is maybe a good idea anyway, though. This is one of the most likely places for the shirt to pop its stitches when you reach forward or up. And do the other sleeve in the same way, well, the opposite way, if that wasn't obvious. 5, the underarm seams. Now is the moment it's really going to become shirt-shaped. Turn it inside out and line up and pin the underarm points so the seams match. Sew the whole of that edge from hem to sleeve end, or the other way around, and do the same on the other side. This is the second and last place you need to do anything about the raw edges if you want to, and I officially give you permission to just let them be raw and fray a bit. If you're sewing with cotton, it'll just turn into a matted edge and you can trim off any big chunks and forget about it. You can try it on now and make any notes about changes to make for your pattern for next time. Particularly check whether the sleeves are long enough, the shoulders fit well, and the neck is in the right place. That's a classic problem, the neck ending up too far forward or back. If it is, lay out your pattern like this and just move the whole neck, cutting away a bit of the paper on one side and adding a bit to the other with tape. Just make sure the overall neck measurement is the same as before. At this point in the making of it though, even if it's not perfect and you've made changes to the pattern, persevere because you'll be glad of the practice with the rest of the tasks. 6, the cuffs. Now then, the cuff, which is lined with contrast fabric in this example, is going to end up here with all its raw edges tucked in and top stitched onto the end of the sleeve. Once again, there's a bit of fancy inside-outery involved. First, we need to make the lined cuff by just laying one main fabric and one contrast fabric piece right sides together, with a bit of interfacing on the outside of this setup if you're using interfacing, and stitch round 3 sides like this. Clip the corners off close to, but not through, the stitched corners and turn it all inside out and press it. Line up the cuff with the sleeve in real orientation. In the animation, I'm flattening out the sleeves, which is impossible in real life because it's a tube, but it's easier to conceptualize this way, and more importantly, it's easier for me to animate, so please suspend disbelief. Flip the cuff so that all the raw edges are lined up together, and the contrast fabric faces the inside of the sleeve. Line one corner up like this, with the sleeve placket edge just inside the cuff rather than exactly corner to corner. Pin the two together, just the cuff lining and the sleeve, right at the edge. You can pin down that bit of seam allowance or not, it doesn't matter. Add another pin for luck a little further in, and then sidle over to do the same on the other side. You'll notice there's more sleeve than there is cuff. What you do with the excess is up to you. A couple of demier pleats, frilly little gather, nice bit of smocking. Do whatever you fancy and condense the sleeve to fit into the cuff. Tucks is the simplest. Go with tucks if it's your first time. Think about where the tucks or whatever will sit, whether you want them hidden underneath or out on show, and also pay attention so you can do the mirror image on the other side when you come to it. Having pinned whatever pleats or tucks in, stitch the sleeve to the contrast or lining side of the cuff only, which is a little awkward at the ends. Just wrench it open and get as far into the corners as you can. Now, you need to do a little origami fold at each end, where you open up the side seam of the cuff, fold in all the raw edges to the inside of the cuff, and neatly close the cuff again. Sorry, it's a little hard to animate, but the idea is to get all the raw edges of the sleeve and of the cuff stuffed inside the open edge of the cuff and lay it all back flat and tidy and looking like a cuff on the end of a sleeve, and then pin it all shut. As you lay down the folded under edge of the outer cuff, you should be folding under the same amount of seam allowance as you have on the stitched side, and the fold should just line up with the visible stitching all the way along. Top stitch the whole lot closed through all layers, quite close to the folded under edge, and if you lined up that edge tidily, it should look neat on the other side as well. It takes practice. Go practice on the other sleeve. 7, the hem. You can just do a fairly narrow rolled hem all along the bottom edge, folding over twice and stitching all the way along. Some people pin and press and fuss about this, but I just fold a bit, stitch a bit, fold a bit, stitch a bit, all the way along from one center front edge to the other. It helps to keep the hem as narrow as you can manage and to consciously avoid pulling too hard on the top and skewing the fold. 8, the button bands. Right, these are quite a lot like the cuffs in a way, so it shouldn't be too bad if you manage them. With the cuffs we stitched 3 sides. With these we only need to stitch 2, the bottom and the front edge, because the other long edge will enclose the center front opening of the shirt, and the top will be eaten up by the collar, so that can be left unfinished. So lay out the pieces face to face and stitch 2 sides on each one. Clip the corners off and invert them. Lay out the shirt and the button bands in real orientation so you know which one goes where, and make sure that you've made 2 mirror ones and not 2 the same, a mistake I have for sure definitely never ever made. As with the cuffs, it's contrast fabric of the button band face to face with the wrong side of the shirt edge to begin with the hemmed bottom edge just inside the button band, and pin or just go ahead and stitch all the way up, remembering not to include the outer layer of button band. At the top, the button band will maybe overshoot the neck. Don't worry, that gets trimmed off and stuffed into the collar. Do the little origami fold at the bottom to enclose the shirt into the button band. Tuck under the seam allowance and pin it all the way up, lining it up with the visible stitching before top stitching through all layers. I do recommend pinning this bit before you stitch, even if you're a non-pinner like me, because otherwise it's easy to accidentally progressively overstretch your fabric as you top stitch and you end up with a skew on your button bands. Once you've done that, go do the same for the other side and we're nearly there. Just the very worst bit of the whole process to go. 9, the collar. I say it's the worst bit, it's actually not that bad, just all the fiddly stuff you've already done rolled into one awkward operation, so no stress. If you're doing the collar bit of the collar, which is totally optional, I love a collarless shirt, you can just stack your 2 layers of collar, which should both be the outer fabric, not the contrast, and an optional layer of interfacing, and stitch round the top and sides, clip the pointy bits as necessary, and turn it inside out and press it. The collar band is the bit that's going to enclose the neck opening, like the cuffs enclose the sleeve ends and the button bands enclose the front edge, whether or not there's a collar involved. So we'll make a little bag like we did with the cuffs and the button bands by sewing the 2 collar band pieces round all but the bottom side, and if you're leaving out the collar, it's as simple as that. So all along the top curved bits, clip it, taking out little V's this time to take away some of the bulk when it's inverted. Turn it inside out and press it. If you are using the collar, do the same thing, but center and pin the finished collar between the 2 layers of collar band like this, so the raw edges of the collar are aligned with the top curve of the collar band, and then sew it all together through all layers. At the curved down edges, try to keep the stitching line straight while you're on the collar, curving only once you're off it, so that the inverting process works without skewing, but don't get too worked up about it, it'll be fine. So you've either ended up with this or with this, depending on whether you are including the collar, and the rest is very similar to the bits we've already done. This neck opening will almost certainly need some little clipped notches to let it open out to the length of the collar band. The collar band can end up a little too long or too short for the amount of neckline available, and you want to know where you're at before you commit to anything, so have a quick rough pin together of the 2 to assess the situation. If there's more collar band than neckline, that's easy. Do your clipping along the neckline and check again, and just clip a tiny bit more at a time until the neckline has stretched to fit the collar band. Trim the tabs if they get unruly long, and change your pattern while you remember what you did. If there's significantly more neckline than collar band, that's a little trickier. First things first, go measure your pattern and amend it if your errant measurement is there, so this doesn't happen again. But to get back on track with your shirt this time though, if the difference is too great to ease it in, you might have to recut the collar band. It's a bit demoralizing, but frankly it's part of making things, just accept it and settle in. Anyway, once the bits more or less fit, you just pin the collar band lining face to face with the inside of the neckline and stitch along there through only the lining layer of the collar band. Fiddly AF at the ends, sorry. Marginally easier done with the shirt body facing up and the collar down as it goes through the machine to keep tabs on those tabs. And then enclose the raw edges as before with the origami folds at the ends and the turned under last edge of the collar band pinned and carefully top stitched down like you did with the cuffs and the button bands. It's fiddlier because it's curved, but the principles are all the same, and once you've done a whole shirt, you've practiced this enclosing thing, at least 5 times, so that's well on the way to it becoming easy. And 10, buttons and buttonholes. Yeah, so I'm kind of going to abandon you here because every machine is different in terms of how it does buttonholes, and you might even be wanting to hand sew your buttonholes for all I know. There are just too many options to cover here, besides to say that if you have access to an automatic buttonholer, my goodness, but it saves a lot of time and effort and swearing. "10 out of 10, would absolutely recommend, cannot live without." I tend to put one button on each cuff, the buttonhole on the overlapping bit in case that wasn't obvious, and 8 or 9 buttons down the front of the shirt, although obviously it depends on whim, and sometimes a million buttons are the path to happiness. I put buttons on the right and buttonholes on the left, being right-handed. There's some idiot convention about women's clothing being the other way around because obviously your lady's maid will be doing up your buttons, but you know what? It's a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and it is time to shoot that 19th century idea dead. Put your buttons on whichever side suits you. As for actually sewing the buttons on, there is a right way to do it, and you get to decide whether you think that's important. Search YouTube for how to sew a button on if you want to know. Otherwise, just sew the little suckers on in the obvious way. That works fine. 11. A last few things. You might like to top stitch various bits, cuffs, collar edges, shoulder tops, whatever. It's optional, but it looks quite nice on shirts. You'll notice I leave you here to make a lot of decisions like that on your own. And also there have almost certainly been bits where you made a mistake and thought she might have mentioned that. But 2 things. 1, I want to keep these videos short and watchable, not tell you what to do in every imaginable situation. And 2, you have common sense. If it went wrong, you can look at it and figure out how and why and what to do about it. That's normal and even desirable and will be more helpful to you in the long run. You don't have to like it, but you can like it. Working through difficulties like that, it's possible to like that. I quite like it. Also, it's unlikely that the fit and placement of every single part of this shirt is absolutely perfect on the first go, so spend some time checking if it could do with some small adjustments. Common examples include, but are not limited to, the neck needs moving forwards or backwards, shoulders need moving in or out, back too tight to put the arms forward, length not right in the sleeves or body, you get the idea. Some of that it's easy to figure out how to fix it and what to do about it, and some there are tricks for. See video 3, when I've made it. And don't forget that any pattern pieces that you change may have knock-on effects to adjacent pattern pieces. But make changes to your pattern if you need to, and get ready to do it all again. It's way easier the second time, and thereafter. So I can knock off a shirt in a day pretty comfortably, having practiced my way past most of the chin stroking and flusterment and holding the pattern instructions upside down stages of learning. You should probably allow a bit longer your first time unless you're quite experienced, but that gives you a general idea of how much actual work is involved. We didn't really talk about darts, but if your shirt is a bit roomy around the middle and you want to slim it down, you can put it on inside out and either you or your spare human can pin some darts in the front and or the back and just sew up the pinned lines. The advantage of doing it now rather than placing some generically shaped darts arbitrarily at the beginning is that now you can put them where they actually need to go and as big as they actually need to be, which is different on everybody. If you do add them though, make a note on the pattern of how big they were and where they go so that you can do it at step 2 next time. And like I said in the last video, if you're busty at all, you will have had some fit issues around this area, and in fact, you will have found the whole exercise a nightmare from drafting onwards. And we will fix that in the next video with an additional dart built into the front piece of the pattern. We'll also look at pocket options, sleeve variations, fancy inset pieces, basically all the interesting things I can think of to alter or augment this pattern so you can showcase your inner Algernon Moncrief or Marilla Cuthbert or whatever your vibe is, and never have to buy a shirt again, because fuck shopping.